Let's convene today's April 30th school committee meeting focused on the redistricting plan. Maybe do roll call to see who's present. Josepha Jowdy,
Yes.
Carol Lewis,
Yes.
Kelly Donahue,
Yes.
Maya Plotkin,
Yes.
and Anthony Vaughn. I'm now going to hand it. So thank you first, before I hand it over to the superintendent, thank you. I know there's, looks like there's about 30 people who've joined this as well. So thank you for joining. And now I'm going to hand it over to the superintendent, who will go over a bit about today's forum and then get into the content.
Great, thank you. Thank you to everyone who's participating in this forum tonight. So our plan for this evening is that I'm going to spend the first little bit doing a and then following the presentation, there will be the opportunity for some Q&A. So there's some information here on the screen about how to participate in tonight's forum. You can join via telephone by dialing one of the numbers on the screen and punching in the passcode for this meeting. All attendees that join are asked to please make sure that your phone is muted. And when it's time to ask questions, you'll be able to do that by pressing *9 to ask a question. At that point, you will be unmuted and will be on the call so that you can ask your question. If you'd prefer to join via computer, the Zoom link is available on the screen as well. You'll be asked to enter your email address and name. The way that you ask a question via the Zoom link is through the Q&A chat tab that's in the lower bar of your window. If you enter your question that way, our moderator will read your question. We'll be reading the questions in the order they're received. And just know that if your question is a duplicate, then it might not be read. And we'll review those directions when it's time for the Q&A. All right. I'm having my first technical problem. Okay. There we go. All right. So tonight, the purpose of tonight really is to share with you the results that we got from the study that we had a redistricting consultant do. So just to review where we are in this building project process, we have narrowed the list of our potential projects now to 7 options. Those options are now being evaluated so that the school building committee can determine a preferred option. That vote's going to be taking place in late June, and that would be the project that we would then continue to move forward in this process. So the reason that we had the redistricting study commissioned is that some of our potential projects may involve consolidation, either of Deerfield and Hanlon or Sheehan and Hanlon. And therefore, we asked our redistricting consultant to review the existing district boundaries and to tell us about the potential impact to districts of those potential consolidations. I do just want to mention that of the 7 options that the school building committee is still considering, there are options that don't involve consolidation, that involve only Hanlon. And we didn't ask our redistricting consultant to take a look at that possibility. We really wanted to understand the impact of consolidating. Clearly, if we were to keep 5 elementary schools, the district boundaries would remain largely the same, though a Hanlon-only option would be for design enrollment of 315. So that accounts for future growth with our enrollment projections. And there might need to be some spot redistricting, but that's something that we could take care of internally in the normal course of how we do business in the district. So this redistricting study was really focused on looking at the impact of consolidation. So though the purpose of tonight is to talk about the findings of the redistricting study, I wanted to spend a few minutes talking more broadly about the concept of consolidation, since the decision to consolidate the district from 5 schools to 4 schools is what would create the need for redistricting. And, the school committee has had more extensive conversations about consolidation at its prior meetings. But I did think it would be important to quickly recap those discussions since it's the backdrop for this redistricting conversation tonight. So at the February school committee meeting, I put this slide up on the screen, and I thought I would put it up again. I think it's helpful when thinking about consolidation to have an understanding of the size of our elementary schools and how they compare to our neighboring districts and also to other high-performing districts. So I have up here on the screen a scatter plot that represents elementary schools in the districts that you see listed on the right side of the screen. These are basically districts in the Tech Collaborative. That's the collaborative we belong to. And then I also threw in Bedford, Concord, Lexington, and Sharon, just because they're districts that we often compare ourselves to when looking at things like MCAS scores. So it's sort of a thought exercise to say, where would you guess that the 5 points representing Westwood's elementary schools fall on this chart? And when we take a look here, Westwood's elementary schools are represented by these green diamonds. So here's where we have Deerfield and Hanlon, Martha Jones, Downey, and then Sheehan. And I think what is probably obvious is that Westwood's elementary schools are really quite small. And I think that's just an important perspective to have as we talk about potentially creating a consolidated school that's a larger size. What's kind of interesting is that when we take a look a little bit further into this chart, what you can see is that all of the schools in the lowest quartile, in fact, are either Westwood, Dedham, or Norwood. So our perspective here in Westwood, we have a perspective of our own district, and if we kind of look to our neighbors directly, to the left and right of us, we see some fairly small schools. It is interesting that all of Westwood's elementary schools are in the lowest quartile, even though Dedham and Norwood are the other two school districts that are in this quartile with us. They actually do, in fact, have some schools that are larger than this and start moving into other quartiles. So it's helpful to have that perspective. And what I would note is that if we take Dedham and Norwood out of the conversation and we look at this list of schools over here and say, well, which of these other districts also have as many elementary schools as we do? There are actually only 2 on this list. So Needham also has 5 elementary schools. Lexington has 6 elementary schools. What's interesting, though, about that is that Needham and Lexington are both more than twice our size. So whereas we currently have an elementary population of 1,266 students, the population of Needham is about 2,660, and the population of Lexington is a little over 3,000. So the fact that our elementary schools are very small clearly does have some nice things about it, but it also presents some real challenges for us. And those challenges have to do with operational efficiencies, but also, frankly, with some educational questions that I think are really important to people in Westwood. So, one of the things that we hear about, I would say probably most frequently at school committee meetings, is concerns that parents have about elementary class sizes. It's clearly very important to Westwood residents that elementary class sizes remain relatively small. And to that end, the school committee has a set of class size guidelines. The guidelines in Westwood are that our K-3 classes will be between 18 and 22 students. And then in grades 4 and 5, we try to keep our classes between 18 and 24 students. And, we think that that's important educationally. What you see here is a little case study to give you a sense of how dealing with very small schools is actually challenging in terms of staying within those class size guidelines. So what I did here was I took the enrollment projections that we used when we were developing the FY21 budget. And so over here, you can see Deerfield. Here we have the number of students that we anticipate will be enrolled in each grade. And when we're taking a look at the budget and thinking about staffing, when we see numbers like this, we know we've got some challenges. These are kind of terrible numbers from an enrollment perspective. So 25 kindergarten students seems large to us, but to split it in half isn't really feasible. 12 and 13 would frankly be too small and also certainly not sort of fiscally responsible. And you can see right up the line at Deerfield right now, we have some real challenges in terms of potentially these kind of large singleton classes. So when we try to figure out what to do there, what we have ended up doing is creating multi-age classrooms. So we're thinking next year at Deerfield, we're probably going to have a kindergarten, a combined kindergarten and first grade, and a first grade. And, you know, I will say that I feel very comfortable with that from an educational standpoint. We think that the multi-age classroom for the K-1 works very effectively, but it's setting up a problem down the line because the multi-age classroom, though it works well developmentally for this age student, really doesn't still work when you're in grades 3 and 4. And so you can see what happens is that at some point, we have to start collapsing those sections back again. So this class of 27 in grade 3, for example, at one point was fine in the KK1 model. But at this point, it's sort of a large singleton class. So next year, one option would be to create this model, to have a couple of large singleton classes. Those numbers are large enough that we would need to put an instructional assistant or some other kind of support into the class. So under this option, I have the need for 9 sections, so 9 classroom teachers plus 2 instructional assistants. And we did say, well, it's possible maybe you would decide to split the 27. Frankly, a class of 13 is very small in terms of how we go about trying to group students and differentiate instruction. There is such a thing as too small, and that probably is too small. Under that option, though, we would need 10 teachers plus 1 instructional assistant. And then if we look at Hanlon here, these are the number of students that we were projecting, and these numbers are a little better. Hanlon is actually a little bit bigger than Deerfield. And you can see that we have different options here. We could have sort of small kindergarten and grade 1 sections. But in that case, we would have some choices to make in other grades. Another challenge with small schools is that we don't have that many spaces. So we really only have 12 classroom spaces at Hanlon to work with. So under this scenario, if we need 2 kindergartens and 2 grade 1s, then we would have to take a class that is currently in 3 smaller sections and collapse them into 2 sections of 23, which is still not a bad class size, but it is one above the school committee class size guidelines. If we wanted to split that back up, we could go to a KK1 model. And the numbers here are fairly reasonable for that, but they're the kind of numbers that we don't like to go into at the beginning of the year because they don't leave any room for growth. At any rate, under either of these options, though, we would need to have 12 sections, so 12 classroom teachers. So just as sort of a thought exercise, we said, well, what would happen if we imagined that Deerfield and Hanlon were consolidated into one school? What does that do to our enrollment? And you can see here the result of it. By just simply having sort of somewhat larger numbers at each grade, there are just more ways to divide up the kids and to kind of smooth out the class sizes. So what we end up with here are good class sizes at every grade across the board and kind of an equitable experience. One of the challenges when you have a situation like this is that we have class sizes that kind of skew and differ widely between grades and also between schools. And that issue of equitable class sizes is something we also hear a lot about from parents. And also, when we look at this, 21 sections, that's potentially a cost savings. So in the separate option here of Deerfield and Hanlon, we were looking at, for option 1, 21 teachers plus 2 instructional assistants, or in the other option, 22 teachers and 1 instructional assistant. So you can see here, 21 teachers, no IAs. It's more efficient, and more to the point, it's better educationally. And quickly, we can take a look at a similar case study using next year's projections for Sheehan and Hanlon. Sheehan, of course, is bigger. It often has 3 sections per grade. And so I just sort of said, well, let's take a look using existing staffing and see how we would divide up those class sizes. And when we put them together, if we said, just for the sake of argument, let's use all of the existing staff that we have, how would we divide it up? And you can see we would end up with these very even, very good class sizes. And what's interesting when you look at this, though, is that the more sections you have, the more options you have in terms of saying, well, do I want 5 sections or 4 sections? And so here we could move from 5 sections to 4 and still have really great class sizes within our range. And you can see here, that's the difference between 28 positions and 25 positions. So there are some efficiencies to be realized and also some good educational reasons for thinking about having slightly bigger schools. Consolidation does present some other staffing impacts. It reduces the need for part-time staff or sharing staff across buildings, which allows us to have more flexibility and efficiency in scheduling. So for example, we currently have 1 art teacher who travels between Hanlon and Deerfield, and that obviously sort of puts another variable into the scheduling process. There might be some reduction in staffing levels of specialists and other service providers, but I do want to say I think that the savings there would probably be fairly modest because staffing in those areas is largely a function of student to staff ratios. So for example, I've had people say to me, well, if you consolidated 2 schools, you would only need 1 principal instead of 2. In fact, though, we probably would have a school of a size where we'd still need 2 administrators, say a principal and an assistant principal. So there might be some modest savings, but not as much as I think I've heard some people assuming, and I just want to be upfront about that fact. Other operating budget impacts. We think that consolidation of 2 schools would have a positive long-term impact on some of the non-salary operating budget. Specifically, we think we would get more for our utility dollars. Our oldest buildings are quite inefficient from a water and energy standpoint. And so a consolidation would quickly take 2 older buildings offline and create some reduction in waste, and also would be more comfortable for students and teachers. We think that maintaining 4 buildings versus 5 is expected to be less costly in the areas of service and maintenance plans. For instance, we would have fewer HVAC systems. From a financial perspective, though, probably the biggest impact is on the capital side of things. And this really is related to the impetus for the whole project in the first place. So I know that the community understands at this point that we have some significant capital needs, significant facility needs in our aging buildings. And what consolidation of 2 schools does is it leads to an immediate and significant impact because we take 2 old buildings offline immediately. And so it's that cost avoidance benefit that we think is something that's very, very significant. That we know in our long-term maintenance plan that we have projects coming up, and those projects are costly. So to the extent that we can either avoid having to do some of those projects, or frankly eliminate sort of the risk of having something break down or need costly repairs, we think that there's a real benefit to that. And so up on the screen here, we have some examples of projects within the next 5 years that we anticipate at Deerfield and Sheehan. And I would add that we have other projects that we will need to do from a maintenance perspective at other schools in the district. So for example, we have a roof project at Martha Jones that we anticipate that would be somewhere in the neighborhood of $250,000, $260,000. And so to the extent that we don't invest our money in some of these aging buildings, it also frees us up to be able to be responsible about maintenance in some of our newer buildings and not defer projects until later. So that brings us to the redistricting report. And so we contracted with a consultant called Cropper GIS, who's very experienced in this kind of analysis. And we asked Cropper to take a look at 3 scenarios. So the first scenario is consolidating Deerfield and Hanlon at the Hanlon site. And the second is consolidating Hanlon and Sheehan at the Hanlon site. And the third is consolidating Hanlon and Sheehan at the Sheehan site. And so Cropper was asked to take a look at that and determine what would be the best way, sort of the optimal redistricting plan in each of those scenarios, and to give us an assessment of what the impact would be of each of those scenarios. So I just put up here on the screen to remind people where the district boundaries are currently. And Westwood has kind of an interesting geographic shape to it, which really does impact the redistricting plan. Just want to say a few words about the methodology. So in thinking about the redistricting, Cropper did include information like our enrollment projections. So we are thinking about the growth of the district potentially. They look at the density of student populations in different parts of town. So I just have up here on the screen, just as an example, this is an example of a density map where you can kind of see where do most of the students who attend a particular school live. They were thinking about length of bus rides, traffic patterns, opportunities for students to walk to school. They were looking at location of schools within districts, specifically thinking about things like, you know, if you were to redistrict, you wouldn't necessarily want to have someone on a bus passing another school on the way to their school. They took a look at neighborhoods, really thought about how to keep neighborhoods together, and looked at things like real estate projections and thinking about housing turnover in different parts of town. So it was a fairly extensive set of data that they were looking at. And in doing this work, they divide things up geographically by what they call planning blocks. So they really think in terms of very small blocks of students and how adjusting the lines changes the population that's attending a particular school. So the first scenario is consolidation of Hanlon at Deerfield for a school with a design enrollment of 560 students on the Hanlon site. And what I've done here is kind of given you the existing map and the proposed map so you can get a sense of the before and after. So what we discovered is that from a redistricting perspective, consolidating Hanlon and Deerfield is actually a fairly simple proposition. So you can see here on the map that in this scenario, our consultant's assessment is that it would be quite feasible to simply erase the line between Deerfield and Hanlon and combine the Deerfield and Hanlon districts without any changes to the remaining three schools. And so in this sense, this scenario really impacts sort of the fewest number of kids. Effectively, the students who attend Deerfield would then attend school at Hanlon. And with that, of course, there would be some change in transportation. So there are students who currently go to Deerfield who would have a slightly longer ride to get to a school at the Hanlon site. The assessment of the consultant, though, is that doing this redistricting would still result in a balanced, what they call utilization rate across the district. And that's taking a look not just at what the impact is on this new Hanlon school, but also thinking about, is it still feasible to keep these districts intact given the facilities that we have? And they think that this is a feasible option. The second scenario is consolidating Hanlon and Sheehan for a design enrollment of 685 on the Hanlon site. So if you look at the before and after map here, you can see that this would involve considerably more redistricting than in the prior scenario. So under this consolidation, the Downey district effectively is not changed, but you can see that there are changes for all of the other remaining elementary districts. So this maroon color would become the district map for what would be the consolidated building on the Hanlon site. So you can see that some students who currently attend Deerfield would then go to Hanlon. Some students who currently attend Sheehan would move to Hanlon, but some students who currently attend Sheehan would become part of a new Martha Jones district. And that some students who currently attend Martha Jones, sort of up here in the maze, would now be part of the Hanlon district. So there would be quite a number of changes under that scenario. The consultant reports that the utilization rates at the different buildings would be good as well with this redistrict scenario. Clearly, in terms of, in addition to kind of the disruption of having people attend new districts, there would be some additional transportation challenges here due to increased travel time for some students who would be attending a new school. So students, for instance, in this part of town who now have to get across town to Hanlon. There would be students living in the westernmost part of the district who would in fact pass Deerfield on their way to Hanlon. So the impact here would be on about 464 elementary students. The next scenario takes a look at consolidating Hanlon and Sheehan with a design enrollment of 685 students at the Sheehan site. And so I think it's probably fairly clear just by looking at sort of the before and after map that this also results in fairly significant disruption. And so really not much change to the Downey district. But you can see here, we basically are taking students who currently attend Hanlon, and those students are redistributed across various schools. That some students who are currently in the Deerfield district would also become part of a new district at the Sheehan site. And some students who are currently in the Sheehan site would be shuffled over to Martha Jones. So there's quite a bit of change here. This consolidation scenario would impact 528 students. So it would impact more students than in the other two prior options. And some of the same transportation challenges would be present due to increased travel time for some students attending the new school at the Sheehan site. When we looked at this, in fact, we went back to the consultant and said, could you take a look at that scenario again? Because the level of disruption here was really striking. And we were curious if they could kind of go back to the drawing board and think about, are there any other options? And so, in fact, we have sort of a second version of the consolidation of Hanlon and Sheehan at the Sheehan site. And in this version, in fact, they kind of they make a little change to the border of the Downey district, and they tried to see if they could improve the situation from the prior scenario that we looked at. But frankly, it doesn't look like option 2 of this scenario was much of an improvement at all. So based on their analysis, Cropper did make a recommendation, which I think probably is fairly apparent after looking at those different scenarios. And so the recommendation from our consultant is that they think that the Deerfield and Hanlon consolidation at the Hanlon site is the most feasible of the consolidation scenarios that we asked them to look at. It impacts the smallest number of students and families. It has the least impact to our current traffic patterns. The resulting elementary school district boundaries are reasonable in terms of student population density, where the students are concentrated throughout the town, and also works with geographic layout using sort of major roads and physical landmarks to set boundaries. This scenario has the greatest potential for student walkers across the district. It maintains existing neighborhoods, and it creates a favorable utilization across schools. So that was the consultant's recommendation. And I think that when the school committee looked at this and heard the presentation directly from the consultant a couple of meetings ago, certainly, correct me if I'm wrong, school committee members, but as I recall, the conversation was that there was widespread agreement that this looked like the most reasonable consolidation option. So just a word on where we're going from here. On May 29th, the school building committee meets to review the 7 shortlist options. We've developed our evaluation criteria, which I would say is quite a bit more detailed than in the first round, where we were moving to the shortlist. Now we're really kind of getting into the nitty gritty. And certainly this issue of redistricting is a big part of that evaluation. On June 2nd, we'll have a community forum to review the options on the shortlist with the costs. On June 11th, the school committee at its regular school committee meeting will vote about enrollment in redistricting as it pertains to the project. And on June 12th, the school building committee is going to be meeting to talk about sustainability options. And that's all leading to June 19th, when the school building committee meets to vote to determine which project would move forward. As always, we encourage people to stay informed by watching our meetings and updates from Westwood Media Center. And of course, our elementary school building project website is always being updated in real time. It's a place that people can submit questions, and we generally get back to people with answers within a couple of days. And we also update our FAQs based on the questions that we're receiving from the public. And with that, I think we will move into the Q&A.
Emily, we're going to start with a question from Fran Fusco of 20 Pine Lane. The first question was, why didn't the redistricting study look at redrawing lines for all 5 schools to relieve overcrowding and to increase learning space?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I touched on that a little bit, I think, at the beginning. So we didn't ask the consultant to look at that issue, because really what we were interested in is what's the impact of consolidation. And so, if the option were to be to go forward with keeping 5 elementary schools and designing Hanlon for design enrollment of 315, that really wouldn't involve wholesale redistricting. I think, over time, when we reach the enrollment peak, we would have to do what's called spot redistricting. We would just have to make some adjustments in the boundary lines, effectively just scoop up a few more kids and put them into Hanlon. But that's the kind of redistricting that we take into consideration internally. So we didn't think we needed the consultant for that. So I think that is the answer. The physical part of the issue here is that the size of the buildings are such that there isn't a lot that can be done. It's not, we don't have a building, for instance, that's underutilized right now. We're sort of shifting kids over to it would be helpful.
Her second question, which I'll paraphrase because there's a couple of questions in here, but could you please elaborate on the potential buses being parked at the Hanlon site rather than the high school? The traffic study was done prior to the proposal. Are you planning to park all the district buses at Hanlon to service kindergarten through grade 12? Where would they be parked on the site? There's some concern about number of trips back and forth and including noise and pollution to the Hanlon neighborhood.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we currently have a parking problem up at the high school, and that's a function of the fact that the high school enrollment is at its peak right now. So I think this is a problem that has sort of bubbled up over the last couple of years, and probably will be the case for another couple of years before the enrollment is projected to go back down. And so we did think there might be an opportunity here to consider moving the buses to a different site to help relieve the parking problem at the high school, and it just made sense to explore that. We certainly haven't made any decision to do that. So the first order of business is just to see if it's even possible. And certainly we understand that parking buses at Hanlon would have some traffic impact. We're just in the exploratory phase at this point and looking at our options, and we would have to dig into the traffic issue a bit more before making any decision about that.
Someone asked, how will existing older schools like the Sheehan be brought up to code, elevator updates, etc.?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's part of what we need to figure out. So I may ask if somebody on the school committee wants to address sort of what the thinking is on that particular issue.
Sure, I can take it. So, this project is, as we've mentioned, will either solve for Hanlon or solve for Hanlon and Sheehan or Hanlon and Deerfield. But regardless, there's going to be either one or two schools that are not part of the MSBA project. We've been aware of this from the start. The school committee has discussed that there will be one or two remainder schools from the start. And what we're planning on doing is, once we understand what this project will entail, which, as Emily mentioned, will be in June, we've already authorized money to start exploring design options for the remainder school or schools. So once we have the June decision on what the final project will be, then we can immediately sort of parallel track design options and get more information about, a potential project for the remainder school or schools. So that's the current project. I know that the current economic situation and uncertainty is worrying everybody, but we have allocated that money to this project, so we're going to move that forward. The design of the exploratory design of the remainder school or schools, and we'll just kind of move that forward and see where it goes. But that's the plan for now.
Another question came in. Would you consider putting in place buffer zones as part of the redistricting?
I think the short answer to that is yes, we would consider that. We have a buffer zone currently at University Station, and we have actually found that a very helpful tool for keeping our class sizes within range. And I want to emphasize that when we make those decisions, we also work very hard to keep kids at the same grade together. We obviously keep siblings together, but I think that is something that we would take a look at for sure.
Another question, to what extent is environmental sustainability impact being considered in the MSBA shortlist?
Do you want me to take that?
Sure.
So we have the School Building Committee has formed a sustainability subcommittee that's made up of some members of the SBC and also has Tom Philbin, who is the town energy manager, on as an ex officio member, as well as a representative from WEAC, which is the Westwood Environmental Action Committee. And so the purpose of this subcommittee is to really look at the sustainable options for this project and come up with a recommendation for the school building committee about how what sustainability should be and should look like in the project. Things that the sustainability committee are examining is, what is the town's current position on sustainability. We know that there is a comprehensive town planning committee, and they have put some draft thoughts down that we are examining, we're reviewing. There's also a non-binding amendment, an article that will be discussed at town meeting regarding sustainability. So all of these things are informing the decisions. And we are also getting direction from the green engineer, which is the environmental consultant that our architect has brought on board, and the architect as well. And we're trying to understand what are the sustainable options we should be looking at, what is the cost benefit analysis of each, and really kind of going from there. So sustainability is absolutely a critical element of this project, and one we're looking at very carefully.
So those are our written questions as of now. I just wanted to remind, there are 3 people who have called in, that if you do have a question, you can press *9 and I can unmute you if you have a question.
While you wait for that, maybe Superintendent, if you could address one other question that a lot of people have, is the maps we've shown, while they're directionally probably very close to where they would end up depending on the options, they're not street by street, they may not be the final map.
No, thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. So no, these maps weren't done with that level of precision. Yes. So if we obviously were moving forward with something, and we would look very carefully at the situation at that time and be precise.
At this time, there are no other questions.
Okay, well, I'll give it 30 seconds. If you have any remaining questions, either via the chat or the phone, let us know. We can do the Jeopardy countdown. Any other comments from the school committee or anyone else that's on part of the panel?
I think one thing about consolidation that the consultant didn't look at, because it wasn't part of the mandate, is if we were to consolidate, for example, Hanlon and Sheehan, that would leave us with Deerfield, which is still a very small school, and as Emily pointed out, presents a number of challenges in terms of enrollment and trying to get appropriate class size. I know a lot of times we hear a lot at school committee, as Emily mentioned, about class size on the large end, but I think class size on the small end is an equal problem. And I think that we do run into both of those issues with a really small school. So that's one point I just wanted to raise. because I've seen it play out, when every summer when we're trying to get these class sizes the right size, we see problems on both too small and too big. So I just wanted to raise that as well.
Yeah, thanks for saying that, May. I think that's actually an important point, is that, sort of eliminating the problems associated with a very small school is important.
Looks like there's more questions.
Yes, we got another question. How much growth are we anticipating with the new project?
Enrollment, I assume we're talking about here. So the MSBA, so the design enrollments of 560 for the Deerfield Hanlon consolidation and 685 for the Hanlon Sheehan consolidation reflect the MSBA enrollment projections and account for new growth. So if you assume for a second that the other buildings in the district would remain about the same, and then the consolidated building accounts for the new growth.
Can the Deerfield School be considered for an after-school community center to help alleviate the library overcrowding?
So
okay.
Go ahead, Maya.
So what's the process for the remainder, if there is a consolidation, the process for the school that is vacated, is the school committee and the district would decide whether or not the school would want to continue to keep the building as a school building and operate it and maintain it. If the district and the school committee decide they do not want to do that there's no longer any use for that school, the school would turn it back over to the town. And I know that the select board has discussed, I'm not sure if they've formalized, but they have discussed creating a subcommittee to look and explore what would happen to a remainder school. So really it becomes, it's turned back to you, to the residents of Westwood, to the town. And the select board would form that subcommittee, and I think whatever the final recommendation would probably have to go to town meeting, is my guess. But that's an idea. I mean, I think that the Deerfield School is in a great location. It's right in the center of the Westwood side of Westwood, and it certainly is accessible for that reason, and walkable, very walkable. So there's a number of things that could happen to it, but ultimately that's not a school decision. I think there's another question.
A follow-up on a previous question on the half school left out, or the 1 out of 2 schools left out of the project. Is the state willing to help fund repairs or rebuild a new school? Or will it be up to the town to absorb the cost?
So by the state willing to help fund, I'm assuming you mean through the MSBA, because that's really the mechanism by which the state funds school capital projects. Given that we have been accepted by the MSBA for this project, we could certainly reapply for the second project, for the remaining school or schools. However, our chances of being accepted into the program when our first project is still in design phase are very low. And I think the MSBA's future budget has been hit particularly hard. It does rely on sales tax for funding. And as we all know, that number has decreased dramatically in the past few months and probably will not see the levels it saw for a while. So my guess is that it's going to start really looking very closely at the schools that it accepts into the program. And I think to the extent we had a chance of being admitted for a second project before the pandemic, I think those chances are have dramatically decreased. So I think that we should all assume that any work that's done to the remainder school or schools will be funded by the town, and there will not be MSBA funds for that building.
I just want to remind people that we consider ourselves very fortunate to have gotten into the program for this project. That the year that we applied, I can't remember at the moment how it was. I think in the neighborhood of 80 some schools.
I think 80, yeah.
Applied, and something like 18 were accepted. So we feel like we have a really important opportunity here.
Okay, looks like any other final closing thoughts, any questions from anyone on the panel?
Oh, I think Charlie might.
Charlie,
Can
you
you
Charlie.
unmute yourself? There you go.
I just wanted to thank the Westwood Media Center for organizing this, putting it together. It's very valuable. And also to say to people that this isn't the end. We're still looking for input, advice, and ideas. So don't hesitate to continue to keep in touch with us with ideas and more questions, because we've got a ways to go here.
Yeah.
We just had another question come in. If Deerfield was redistricted, would the school board be amenable to supporting the transition of the property to the town to subsidize the renovation of the remaining school?
Well, so if we consolidated and then Deerfield were then vacant, then the school committee would be required to return that property to the town, but there would be no financial gain for the school district, so to speak. So the property would return to the town, and the town would then, and the residents of the town would then determine what the use might be for the building, but there would be no financial transaction involved in that. I think that's what the question is. Is that?
Yeah, and Tim, I know you're muted. I know you talked to me about this. I think the MSBA actually explicitly requires you as part of the plan not to, they don't want people selling it to developers, I think, but maybe Tim, somebody can talk to that better than me. I don't know if it's Tim or one of you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So basically the town needs to come up with a plan for that school, but and they don't want it sold to developers or any way that it makes money. So I think it's going to be part of how the sort of rollout of this happens, is the town will need to at least come up with a plan or a process for a plan, by the time the town's ready to vote on it.
Thanks, Tim.
Right. And rightfully so. They don't want, the MSBA doesn't want to help us fund a flip, if you will, where we build a new building, and the building that's vacated, then the town makes a profit on. So that's not the intent of the MSBA, and I think that's why they look very carefully at what happens to that remainder school.
Another question came in. What would be the timeline for the remainder school project in parallel with the main project?
So our timeline currently is this next spring of 2021 is when we would present the MSBA project to the town to vote for the funding for the entire project. What we would like to do at the same town meeting is present a design, a preliminary design of what we're calling the remainder school project to the town, and ask the town to fund design money for that project. And that, we would have a preliminary design, but then you'd have to go into schematic design, and there's a whole further design process that you'd have to go through that would require additional funds. So we would ask the town to fund that design program, and then come back to the town and say, okay, now that we've got the design, can we fund the construction? I think that would put the remainder school project 6 months to a year behind the MSBA project, just that process.
All right, it seems like we've got all the questions in. So just, I'd like to thank, I think there were 50 plus community members, which is great.
Great.
Continued great participation in this session. Mark those dates in June on your calendar. Obviously, you can reach out, as the superintendent mentioned. We get, anytime you have questions, you can go onto the website. So thank you. Thanks for everyone. And thanks, Superintendent, for leading the discussion tonight.
Great. It was great. We had so many participants. I'm thrilled. Thanks.
I know.
All right. Great. So with that, can I have a motion to adjourn the school committee meeting?
I'll
So
make the
moved.
motion. Oh, I'll
Have a
second.
All right. I'll do a roll call. Josepha Jowdy. Josepha?
Here I am. Yes.
Thank you. Carol Lewis?
Yes.
Charlie Donahue? You're on mute, Charlie.
Yes.
Thank you. Plotkin
Yes.
and Anthony Mullen, yes. All right, everyone have a great night.
Great.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Appreciate the
Westwood Media
engagement.
Center. Thanks, Melinda. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Westwood Media Center.